In addition to her teaching that salvation is a process, another important concept here is that of the battle that Santa Teresa is referring to when she speaks of,
"Here, sisters, you will see the importance of having overcome in your past battles."
of course, it's a struggle that each of us fights as we attempt to overcome our desires and bad habits and move toward that perfection that Jesus demanded of Christians. She certainly wasn't referring to something like the Crusades. As the Prophet Muhammad said after winning a great battle, yes, but the greater jihad is the battle within. When I first read the Bhagavad Gita back in the days when I was an atheist, I thought, how can anybody think this is a spiritual book? It's a story of a bloody, violent battle. I think I maybe even saw a picture of Krishna and Arjuna in a war chariot, with Arjuna attempting to control the 5 unruly steeds pulling the chariot. Only after I read Guruji's version of the Bhagavad Gita did I understand the spiritual significance of this story. As Yogananda teaches in his version, he who with non-attachment to sensory pleasures governs the stallions of his senses by holding tight the reins of his mind, keeps them on the wisdom-directed path of proper action. A royal expert, he rides the bodily chariot to the supreme goal. The man of worldly responsibilities, who keeps his senses under mental control, who works only for God and thus remains unattached to his own desires and ambitions, ultimately by right action will reach the divine goal. The Bhagavad Gita is scarcely the only scripture to describe that struggle as a battle. Here's a copy of the Etzaim, the 2001 translation of the first 5 books of the Bible by Conservative Judaism. Just reflect upon what the study companion to the Etzaim has to say about the Battle of Jericho, for example. It says, the unwalled and uninhabited Jericho and Ai, respectively, clearly seem to contradict the violent and complete conquest portrayed in the book of Joshua. How's that? The unwalled city of Jericho? About 11,000 years old, Jericho is one of the oldest cities on earth, and during its long history, Jericho at times did have walls. But Jericho had no walls at the time the Bible claimed the battle took place? Oh. So according to the study companion, the account of the Battle of Jericho as given in the Bible is not historically true. Even if the study companion is right, and the fundamentalists, of course, with some merit, do not agree that it is right, does that mean the story is false? The story of the Hebrews' exodus from Egypt, of which the Battle of Jericho is part, is a true story when one understands the intent of its authors, who it seems to me clearly intended to write a spiritual lesson rather than a history book. Now, I have nothing against history books. I read them myself from time to time, and I'm inclined to believe that the story of Exodus probably has its roots in some incident that really happened. Even though there is no unambiguous archaeological evidence that a large number of Hebrew slaves ever revolted, some linguistic evidence does exist to support the idea that the story is drawn from some kind of historical event. Be that as it may, regarding the common practice of seers and prophets to mix history and scriptural revelation, Yoganandji says that without couching spiritual truths in the language of concrete historical narratives, divine profundities would not otherwise be conceivable by the ordinary man. So yes, the history is important. However, it is a questionable service to the intentions of the authors to try to turn the story of the Exodus and other profoundly spiritual stories in the Bible into mere history tales. Indeed, as I'll try to show later, it was largely because of the misguided interpretations of the fundamentalists that I became an atheist. Once I became aware of the contradiction between science and my fundamentalism, not to mention the internal contradictions of the Bible, I no longer could believe in the literal, materialistic interpretations that I had been taught. Unaware of superior interpretations, I became an atheist. And I'm scarcely the only one. I have here a couple of books by Bart Ehrman, one of my favorite biblical scholars. First is Lost Christianities, which I read some time back, The Battle for Scriptures and Faiths That We Never Knew. And the second is Misquoting Jesus, The story behind who changed the Bible and why. I've noticed that through the years Bart Ehrman's books are becoming increasingly autobiographical in nature, and especially in this book he talks about what happened to him as a teenager. He says that as a teenager he felt an emptiness, and he was persuaded by a certain professional Christian to accept Jesus Christ and become a born-again Christian, which he did. And after that, he said he really wanted to get into hardcore Christianity, so he enrolled in the Moody Bible Institute. Now, if you go to any fundamentalist website, such as the one I just quoted from earlier, and if you look at the history of fundamentalism, you'll see that there are two names associated with fundamentalism, two names of institutions. One is Biola, Bible Institute of Los Angeles, and that's my mother's alma mater. And the other is Moody Bible Institute. And it is currently seen by the fundamentalists as teaching the one true gospel that the fundamentalists believe in. All the professors there are required to sign a statement that they will not teach any other deviant idea about the Bible and about Jesus. The Bible is the inerrant Word of God. It is verbally inspired. And I quote from a website, fundamentalist website that I quoted from earlier. On its webpage where it talks about its doctrine, under number 1, the inspiration of the Bible, it says, verbally inspired word and revelation of God. In other words, the very words were inspired by God, dictated by God, and written down by people who were in contact with God directly. And this has come to us in the King James Version in its pure form, just as God dictated the words. Even the translators were inspired. There were no errors. And all of the copyists who made copies and so on were inspired. Now, there's a trouble with this, according to Bart Ehrman. There was an obvious problem, however, with the claim that the Bible was verbally inspired down to its very words. As we learned at Moody, in one of the first courses in the curriculum, we didn't actually have the original writings of the New Testament. What we have are copies of these writings, made years later, in many cases, many years later. Moreover, none of these copies is completely accurate, since the scribes who produced them inadvertently and or intentionally changed them in places. All scribes did this. And he goes on to mention that we have some 5,000 copies of the writings dating back to about the 2nd century. And there are more differences between the copies than there are words in the New Testament. So there's no way to know which copies are accurate. In fact, there's every reason to believe he says that there's no copy that is perfect because the scribes always made errors. You have to realize that just imagine how boring it would be to copy the entire Bible day after day, word by letter. And in those days, there was no punctuation. So you didn't know where one sentence ended. There was no uppercase, lowercase. There were no capitals to mark the beginning of a sentence. So people had to just guess where the sentence began and where the sentence ended. And same with the words. There was no way to know where one word ended and the next word began. So there was a lot of guesswork involved. The scribes had a very difficult task. And also in the first few centuries of Christianity, they were amateur scribes. They weren't professionally trained. They just did it in their spare time. Christianity at that time, by and large, was composed of illiterate people. And whatever illiterate person there might be in the congregation, that was the person that was chosen to be the scribe and to make copies for the rest of for the church or for the rest of the congregation. In the other book, Lost Christianities, he gives a very interesting case of one scribe who had copied a certain section, and apparently that scribe put the work aside for who knows for how long, and came back to it some later time, and he had forgotten where he'd left off. And so he recopied the same passage again, and we can find a number of differences between those two copies. In other words, the same scribe, working from the same documents, nevertheless introduced new errors. So the business of copying was extremely inaccurate, and in many cases the scribes intentionally put things right as they saw it, by not copying the original words, but putting in the words that corresponded with their understanding of truth. They had good intentions, but the point is, we don't know what the original words were. And he goes on to give specific instances with the documentary evidence showing that parts of our what we consider to be our New Testament now did not exist in the earliest documents. These were additions that were put in later. And so there's no way that anybody can say that the King James Version or any other version is that an exact reproduction of God's own words. It just doesn't make any sense. According to polls, the fastest growing segment of religious thought in the United States is not Hindus, not Muslims, not Jews, not Catholics, and not even evangelicals. It is, in fact, those who are being raised in homes with no religion present. This irreligious segment doubled in just the last 3 decades of the 20th century. For me and for everyone I've heard talk about this topic, losing one's religion is an extremely painful experience. In order to avoid such needless confusion, I think it would be a good idea to heed the advice given in a study companion of the Etzaim. It says, archaeological material questions the historical accuracy of biblical text, forcing us to realize that the Bible is not an objective historical document. The Bible's value lies not in its historical accuracy, but rather in the religious and theological truths that it conveys. And what exactly is the truth conveyed in the story of the Exodus? It is the story of each person's battle as he struggles through several stages of faith. First, one must leave the comfort of slavery to the Pharaoh of worldly power and pleasure. Second, one must wander for a period of time in the wilderness. According to Yoganandji, the image of the wilderness in the story of the Exodus represents meditation. But even though the wilderness may be peaceful, it is also austere and unrewarding. If you're familiar with the biblical story, you may recall that at times the children of Israel even regretted that they had left the comforts of slavery in Egypt. The problem is, this period of one's spiritual growth is a time of frustration. The sensual delights have been renounced or at least moderated, but the spiritual delights of the promised land of milk and honey have not yet appeared. St. John of the Cross referred to this time as the dark night of the soul. And how long does this dark night of the soul last? For some a very long time, as we learn from another Teresa, Mother Teresa of India. Shortly after going to Calcutta in 1948 to care for the poor and the sick, she wrote to Reverend Michael Vanderpeet, "Jesus has a very special love for you," she assured Vanderpeet. "But as for me, the silence and the emptiness is so great that I look and do not see, listen and do not hear. The tongue moves in prayer but does not speak. I want you to pray for me, that I let him have a free hand." In several dozen letters she bemoans the dryness, darkness, loneliness, and torture that she's suffering. She wanted those letters destroyed at her death, but was overruled by the church. Now they've been published in book form. Early in her spiritual life, she had some deeply moving moments. And then for another glorious 5-week period in 1959. But never again.